Okay, in this tutorial we're going to cover health and lives. So to give you a demo of what this is. Alright, so we have a character here. He can move left and right and jump. And we have our health gauge up here, which is a health bar, and we have the live system. So the health bar will decrease when you get hit by an enemy. So there's a bat right there, and it looks like I missed him. Alright, so I hit this slime. You can see the health bar is decreasing as the character is hitting the enemies. I probably should use a different color besides dark blue, but eventually when the life is fully drained, then a health bar, a heart will disappear. So we'll cover how to do lives and health bar. We'll also show how to get the enemies to minus the life from the player. Last video we covered how to do the attack so I can fight back, but in this case we have the option to lose health. And so that's what this video is going to cover. Alright, so let's pause that and jump over to our project. Alright, and I'm using Unity 5, but Unity 4 should be fine with this also. And this is Playmaker we're going to be coding with. Alright, so the first thing we want to do with this character, actually let's cover where we last left off with. So right now we have the character moving left and right, jumping, and he can collide with the enemies, but they don't have any health yet. But the enemies follow him. Alright, and so that's what we have. So let's pause that. And let's go over with importing some sprites. So I'm going to pull up our sprites. I'm going to take a health bar, a health heart, and a health gauge. This will kind of make it fancy. These will be a live system. And the health bar I'm going to use as a white object. You can color it ahead of time if you want to, but by using white, you can use Unity to change the color inside the game. So let's drag all three of these into the sprites folder. And let's check on the sprites. We do need to change one thing here, but I'll explain that later. We have the health gauge here. You can see that there's a checkered background, and this means that it's transparent. And if you look through the glass, you can also see the checker pattern, which means that I drew glass with like painted white light highlights on there. And so when the health bar, which is this, gets set underneath of the health gauge, it'll make it look fancy and look like the health is draining from inside of the health gauge. And then we have our hearts, which will be the life system, and all the rest of this should be fine. So the first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to take the health bar and drag it into, I guess, the scene. That's the game mode. So let's click to scene, and I'll drag it in the scene, and then kind of center it on this screen in comparison to where I want the camera to look at it at. And I'll cover this more a bit later, but depending on what screen ratio you have, there's the 16:9 right now. If I do 4:3, you can see it gets cut off a little bit, so you have to figure out which screen ratio you're going to want. Free aspect, 5:4, 16:10. So whatever you pick will determine where you want to place your health bar. And you could use GUI, graphical user interface, but I'm going to be using sprites instead. And I'll cover GUI and sprites so you can see the difference between the two of them. Alright, so now that we have the health bar dropped in here, let's go to add component, and we're going to put Playmaker coding on the sprite. So we have Playmaker FSM. I'm going to call this, let's call it health, I guess. Alright, so I have our health on there, and it names it here also. On state number 1, I'm going to call this check hit, to check if the player has been hit or not. And I'm going to need an event to send it somewhere. I'm going to say there's health changed, and I'm going to add another event called lose life. Alright, and then right click here, add transition, and use the health changed, and add transition, lose life. Alright, so now that we have this here, let's go add some coding to here. So the first thing I'm going to add is float compare, and drag this in here. We're going to compare his life, which we haven't set yet, so I'm going to go to variables and create a variable that denotes how much life the character has. Instead of putting a variable on the character, I'm going to put a global variable, which means it's accessible by all the objects in the game. Because if it's just a regular variable on the FSM, it's relevant only to the FSM, which is, in this case, the health one. You can pull off variables from other FSMs as well, but if you just call it a global variable, so I click on global, it can be used by all the other ones. So the slime and the bat can change the global variable of the player's health so they can cause damage to the player. So I'm going to make a new variable, and I'm going to call this one player health. Press enter, and I want a float variable, so I'm going to add that on there. So we have the player health. Right here where it says the float value, this is his default hit point starting state. Right now it's set to 0. I'm going to put that to 100 and press enter. So this will start him at 100 hit points. If you want him to have 1 hit point, 10 hit points, 1,000, whatever you want, this is your starting value when the player health gets created. So let's close this out. And it won't appear here until you actually use it in your code. So I'm going to click on the state and say float number 1 is the global player health. So now that I have this on here, we can see that now it's been used. So there's no variables in the character, but there's a global variable called player health used once. Alright, so back to the state, we're going to float compare the player health, which is 100, because that's what it's starting at, to 0. And if it's equal to 0, we're going to say he loses a life. And the same thing for less than 0. He's going to lose a life as well. So whether he has 0 health, then he loses a life. But if he has, let's say, 10 hit points left and he loses 50, then he'll be negative 40, so it's less than. So either equal or less than. In either case, we want to check this every frame and say that he's going to lose a life. Now we're going to go add a state, and I'm going to call this the lose life state. And I'm going to add, let's connect this first. So when he loses a life, it'll transition over to here. And we're going to go put on, let's do this, restart level. Alright, and this will actually crash your game because there's a problem with the code, and I've crashed it twice making this tutorial. So make sure you add one more thing to this. The problem is, as soon as your player reaches 0 health, it's going to restart the level, which makes sense, perfectly fine. But the problem is, as soon as the level gets restarted, he still has 0 health. The health hasn't changed, so it's going to restart your level. And it's going to check when it restarts, and you're just going to create an unending loop, which will check every frame of the game, which basically will freeze your program because this unending loop is constantly trying to restart your level, and Unity will crash. So we need to make sure that we reset his health back to 100 before we restart the level. So we're going to go to set float value right there, and do this before we restart the level. Don't put it after, because you'll restart the level before you even get to changing his life. So before it restarts the level, we need to set the global health back to 100. And we don't need to do every frame, just once. This will reset his life back to 100 before the level restarts. You would think that the global variable would reset when the level resets, but it doesn't quite do that. So we need to reset it manually before then. Alright, so once that's done, we're good. It restarts the level. Now we're going to say what happens if the level, if he doesn't have 0 health, if he actually loses, let's say, 10 out of 100. So we're going to go back to here, and we're going to add on, let's say, a float clamp. And by doing this, we'll drop it underneath of the float compare. We're going to say, take the global's player health. He has a minimum of 0 and a maximum of 100. We'll do it every frame. So if your player has, let's say, 10 hit points and he loses 50, which would be negative 40, this will say he can't go below 0. He has a minimum value. It's clamping it between 0 and 100, in which case it kind of nullifies the need for having less than. But just in case, if he did somehow make it to negative, he'd be invincible because it would never go equal to 0 to restart your level. So I'll leave it in either case. But it also clamps it at 100, so if you have 100% life and you pick up a 10 health point bonus, you wouldn't go to 110, it would limit you to being 100. If you wanted to go past 100, then you could basically ignore the clamp part and it would just keep scaling upwards and your health bar would keep rising. But since I'm going to have an image that kind of contains the health bar, I don't want it leaking out the other end, so I'm going to clamp it to 100. Alright, so the next thing I want to add is float operator, and we're going to create a mathematical operation. We're going to take float 0 and change that to a variable and grab the global's player health, and we're going to set this to 100. So we're going to take the player's health of 100 and divide it by 100. So 100 divided by 100 is going to equal 1. We're going to store this, but before I store it, we're going to do every frame also. But before I store it, let me add one more thing to show you what we're aiming for. So set float no, not set float, set scale. Set scale, drag this in here, and I'm going to set the scale of a variable that I need to create. So I'm going to make this the health scale. So the health scale, let's go back to the state, and I'm going to put this as health scale as the X, and we'll do this every frame as well. And let's jump back to variables, inspector, click that on. By turning the inspector on, it shows it in the inspector tab up here. If you don't have that checked, it won't show it here. This basically gives us debugging controls. We can adjust this while the game's playing and see how things work. So this whole state that I just added, the set scale, is unnecessary. You don't need this on here. This is just to demo what's going to happen. Alright, so if I were to press play now, and the set scale by default is 0, or health scale 0. So if I scroll this upwards, you can see that the health bar is scaling. So as the enemies hit it, it'll affect our scale, and it'll grow smaller, and health will increase it. What happens is 0 is going to be completely not there, and 1 is going to be a full 100%. If you go past 100, this would be like 172%. This would be like 297%. So 1 is 100%. So that's how this health scale works, and we're going to, let's pause this. So we're going to have this, this code affect how this scales. But you might also notice that the health is scaling from the center. So if I were to scale this up and down, you can see that the center of the health is where the origin point is. If you want that effect, you can just leave it as is, but what's causing that is, let's go back to the health bar, and it's set to the pivot point of center. So I'm going to change this from center to the left side of the screen, and that should make the left of the sprite be the origin point. So now if I go back to the health bar, I'll apply the settings, yes, and then I press play, and then I scale this health bar. You can see that it's growing from the left side outwards. And so that's how you would adjust that if you wanted it to be starting from a certain point. And if you go negative, it'll start going the other direction. Alright, so we've got the origin point adjusted. So the code that I just added here, the one that we don't need, the set scale, I'm going to right click, copy selected, and then delete it. We're going to put that on its own state. So add state. This state's going to be called show health, and I'm going to paste it here. Alright, so on the show health area, that's where it's going to change this, but once it's in show health, it's harder to kind of demonstrate how that works. Alright, so we don't need every frame here, we just need to do it once. So it's going to, when your player gets hit, scale his health and visually show what's happening. Alright, so let's jump back to here. So the float operator, we're going to store this result as the health scale. So now that I've stored it as a health scale, I can't change the slider anymore. It won't let me change that because it's storing it. It doesn't work anymore. And the reason it doesn't work is because every frame of the code, it's taking it saying your player health is 100. I'm dividing 100 by 100. I'm getting 1, so your health scale is 1. It's 100% the entire time, so I can't change it anymore. So that's why I did it earlier, to kind of show you how it will scale. Alright, so now that we have this, we also want to add one more thing. Float scale. Float changed. There we go. Alright, so the float changed. The float variable is going to be the health scale, and changed event is health changed. So when your life is at 100, you lose 10 hit points, it mathematically calculates it, divides it, and says that you lost 10, so scale it at 0.9 and save that as health scale. If the health scale then changes because it went from 100 to 90%, then it's going to transition and tell it to, okay, now show it. So if your health doesn't change, it won't do it all the time. It only does this when it recognizes that this variable has changed, thus I need to go transition to here, and once it reaches here, add transition finished, go back to here. Alright, and that should work for this. We don't need to put a finish transition here because once the level restarts, the code doesn't need to go back here, it'll just restart the level back to normal. But I guess you could put a finish there if you wanted to. But the most important thing is make sure you reset that variable back to 100% before you restart that level. So in this stacked up order. Alright, so that should work for all this. Now, we can't really test this because we don't have a way for the enemy to lose or to hurt the player. So let's make that. Alright, so we're going to take the we're going to make the enemy cause damage to the player. So let's grab, let's say I'll go with the bat first, and this is relatively simple to do. I can add this to the collision if I wanted to, where the player hits the sword, but the problem is the code will read this separately. So if you put the code here and you say, does the bat hit the player or does the bat hit the sword? If the bat hits the player and it says, okay, minus 10 hit points from the player, and you're waiting here to go back to the start point, and you hit the bat while the code is sitting here, it won't be asking, is the sword hitting the bat? So it basically makes the bat invincible. So if you have a 1 second wait period of the bat, before it can hit you again, so you're temporarily invincible for a second before you keep getting hit again, then that 1 second means that the player can't hit the bat because the bat is waiting to ask, is it hitting the sword or the player? So it kind of, you don't want to make the bat invincible, so I'm going to add a brand new FSM. And this FSM I'm going to call player hit, but you can call it whatever you want. So now I have collision. I could rename this one calling hit sword, or sword hit versus player hit, whatever you want to call it to differentiate it. This way, regardless of whether the player is hit or not, the player can still inflict damage on the bat. Alright, so let's go to state 1, and I'm going to put, for state 1, I'm going to call this collision, and I'm going to make a transition event. So let's go over to events and call this hits player, and let's right click on here, add transition hits player to reveal that. And when he hits the player, we're going to add a new state called hits player, or you can say minus health or whatever you want to do. I'm going to need another transition, but instead of making a new one, I'm just going to use finished, the default one, and send it back to here, and this one to here. Oops. Alright, so when the player or the bat collides with the player, he hits the player is going to lose life, and then go back to here. So we have a nice looping pattern here. So let's add the code for that now. So the first thing I want to add on here is trigger 2D event, and drop this in here. The reason we're using trigger 2D, there's another option called collision 2D event. We don't want to use this one, and the reason is because this bat is a trigger. So if the bat was collision, he'd be just like the slime, where we can push him and he can push us. It's a collidable object, in which case you would use the collision 2D. But because the bat is a trigger, he's only triggering an event to happen, so you can pass right through him and it won't actually, you can't push resistance against him, it's just going to slide right behind you. But because he's a trigger, we need the onTrigger event to cause the damage. Alright, so onTrigger enter, collide tag, let's click this off, and we'll use the player collide tag. It's one of the default ones that came with the game, or that come with Unity. I've added a couple since then. I also realized that I must have added a player option in a previous one, and it's giving me a player already registered. So the collide tag, I don't need a player tag because it's already with one. So I'm going to click that and remove this one. So I don't need an extra one there. So if I go back to the health bar, it still has a player option. I'm not going to put a tag on the health bar, but you can see it still has that. Alright, so the player health, the player tag will go to show, oops, we're on the bat. Alright, so collide tag with the player, because the player is already named as a player, player tag. And we're going to send event to hits player. So on collision enter with the player, the bat hits the player. Now, there's also another technicality that we need to take into account. So I'm going to take this, right click it, copy, click off of there, and then paste actions. So now I have a duplicate. And the reason is we want to change the collision enter to collision or trigger stay. So we have trigger enter and trigger stay. The difference is, let's say you're walking against the slime hits you once and you're pushing him away. So now you are temporarily invincible because the slime isn't entering your collision anymore. He's already there. So as long as you're still touching him, he can't enter because he's still there. So you'll be invincible as long as you keep pushing him. So if you do on trigger stay, that means once you enter and while you're staying, you're still going to take damage. So this way you account for both entering and staying in that position. So you would want to get away from it at that point. Alright, so we have enter and stay. In both cases, they're both going to be hitting the player. Now, if you wanted your character to be invincible while you're pushing him, just hit him once and then keep pushing him, then you just ignore the stay option. Alright, so we're going to go over here. So in either case, he hits the player. So what happens when the player gets hit? We need to add a float. We can do two options. We can either add negative 10 hit points, or we can do float subtract and just take 10 hit points off. So either option, you can add life. So if you pick up a health pack later, you can float add, but I'm going to float subtract off of the player's health. So we take 10 hit points off. We don't need to do it every frame, just the one time it occurs, and we're going to minus the 10 from the player health, which starts as a global variable of 100. So it takes 10 off of the 100, and the health bar up here will update that and scale it accordingly. And that's pretty much all we need to do. So there is one more problem with this, but I'll demonstrate what happens. So I press play, and I run over to the bat, and the bat starts following me. And eventually when the bat gets in range, we can see it here. The health bar is instantly gone, level got restarted. So if you caught what just happened, if I run over here again and find that bat, boom, instantly I'm dead. In 1 second or less, I'm instantly killed. The reason is the bat is constantly colliding with me. So if I go back to the bat, he's collided with me. Oops, change following to hits player. So he's collided with me and staying on me, and is checking this every frame of the game. So within 1 second, he's hit me 30 times. That's 300 hit points gone in 1 second. So what we need to do is we need to have the bat wait before it can hit me again. Otherwise, it's just going to drain your life in a second. So we're going to add a wait on here. So we're going to wait for a timer interval of 1 second before we go to the finish state. So now when the bat hits me, he'll minus 10, and then wait a second before he repeats this looping pattern of minusing 10 more off me. This way you have about 10 seconds of hitting him before he actually kills you completely. So yeah, the wait's kind of important. You can set different timers, but this makes your player invincible, at least to the bat. If you have like 10 different bats on you in an instant, then they'll all hit you and they'll all drain your life in a second. So we can code that alternatively also, but at least in this case, the bat's waiting before he can inflict damage. If you wanted to make your player completely invincible to immune to every enemy, we'd have to put a block on him to prevent his life from draining during that time. But for now, we're just going to leave it with this. Alright, so the bat now can hurt the player, and if I try this again, let's run over here and find the bat who's coming down, and we can notice that it's gradually bumping one at a time. For every 1 second, it's gradually dropping, and eventually when it reaches 0, the health gets restarted back to 100 just before the level gets restarted and prevents the looping crashing of Unity, and we're good. So we have the health covered. The next thing, let's copy this code to the other three, or the other two enemies. So I'm going to click on the bat, select these two, let's copy states, and then click on the bat, the flying one. I'm going to add a new one. Again, I don't want to put on the collision because he becomes invincible once he's hit me. Add state, let's call this one hits player. Right click, paste states, replace as the current default state, and then erase state 1. So now the same exact code applies. It's going to, oh wait, I copied the wrong one. Let's delete that. I copied the wrong code. I copied the following. Okay, back to player hit, select this code, copy states, back to this bat, paste states, replace as the start point, and delete that one. Boom. Alright, so now when the player gets hit, in either case, hitting or staying on the player, it minuses his health and waits a second. And then one last one, click on the slime. The slime collision with the player. We've already actually coded this one before, whether it's colliding by jumping on the player or whether he's bumping into the player. So we already have a hurt player state here. we just need to add one more thing, and we have again the weight, where it's not going to drain him instantly. So we just have to add that one option on here, which is the float subtract. So we'll take float subtract from the globals player health, and we're going to take 10 hit points off, and then go to the finish state. If I wanted this slime to really hurt me, I could say take 30 hit points off. And so now the slime will hurt me a lot more than the bats, and I can differentiate between which one's which based on what number I type here. So the slime will take 30 hit points off, and the bat will take 10 hit points off. In either case, they'll wait a second before they can hurt me again. So we've quickly added all the collision code to hurt the player now. So let's move on to the next step, which is making this health bar a little more pretty. Alright, so actually let's test this real quick. Let's make sure this works. So the player walks over to the slime. Let's make sure he doesn't jump on top of him. And boom, it took a significant amount off the player. So he's losing a lot more health because he's hitting the slime. Okay, so now let's make the health bar a little more fancy. So in order to do that, I'm going to go over to the health, I guess the health bar itself, or let's go health gauge. I'll take the health gauge, and I'm going to drag this health gauge into the scene. And as you can see here, when I drag it over top, you can probably see here a little easier. I'll zoom in here. Wherever it's moved, even if I move it over top of the grass, you can see the grass through there because it's kind of like a shiny window that I made with a transparency layer. The player's in front of it, so I can't see that, but I can see through the slime and all that. So by putting the health gauge over top of the health bar, it looks like the health bar is filling with life. And so when it minuses life, you'll see it looks like it's minusing health. And you can kind of see through it everywhere else. So I'm going to position this, and I already, when I did this in Photoshop, I scaled it to the right size so I knew it would already fit. So that should work just fine right there. And because it's a white health bar right here, if I can click on the health bar, actually the one in the scene, and I can change the color. So if I wanted this to be, let's say, a red color, you can see it has the red health gauge now. If you've already brought it in as a color, you're kind of multiplying colors together, so you're going to get a different color. But if you bring it in white, then you have the option of changing different colors. And I can bring another health bar in here as well without the code. And this way, if I do, let's say, green in life, and as the green decreases, it would leave the secondary health bar sitting underneath of it. So that kind of makes sense. If I were to take another health bar, drop it in here, and put this underneath of the other one, as the green decreases, you would see a different color underneath. But at the moment, because I don't have one underneath, when the green decreases, it just leaves the sky color in the background. So you can play around with that if you wanted to make it more noticeable and put red behind it. Anyway, so I have the health bar and I have the health gauge. The health bar has the code that's going to decrease his life, and we change it to a green color. But when I press play, as fancy as it is now, the health bar doesn't follow the character. Because it's not a GUI, it's not graphically on the screen, it's a sprite. The sprite is kind of just stuck wherever you dropped it. So we're going to add some code to move the sprite around following the character. So I'm going to take the health bar, and I'm going to drag that on top of the health gauge. By doing so, this parents the health bar to the health gauge. So I only have to code the health gauge to move, and the health bar will automatically move with it. So if I take the health gauge now, and I add a component, and I'm going to put the Playmaker FSM on the health gauge. And so I'm going to call this, let's call it, I guess, health gauge. Sure, that works. Health gauge, and then state number 1, health follows player. So that's kind of what this is going to happen, so I'll just name that state, and this is the only state I'm going to need. So on the action browser, if I click that, it just opens up this. We're going to get position, and I need to get the position of specify game object and list the object from the scene as the character. Until I make a character prefab, it's not going to be in the assets, but once I do that, I might have to re-switch this around because it's no longer going to be the character in the scene. But either way, I'll worry about that later. So the character is the game object, so this FSM is coded to the health gauge. So the health gauge is getting the position of the character. And once the health gauge knows where the character is, we're going to store that as a vector. But I can't store it until I make a variable. So I'm going to make a variable called position. And it can't be a float, it has to be a vector 3. Vector 3 is like 3D, you get x, y, z. Vector 2 is going to give you x and y. But we can't use the vector 2 on this vector because it's asking for x, y, z. So we need to use it, a vector 3 because it has 3 variables. Otherwise it won't appear in the list. So the vector 3 gives us a position, and then we're going to do this every frame. So every frame of the game, every second, 30 times a second, it'll check where the player is, and it's going to save his position as a vector. And now we're going to go add another one and say set position. And we're going to set the position of the user owner, which is the health gauge, and we're going to set it to the vector that's been saved every frame of the game. So basically it'll match this to the player's coordinates every frame of the game. There is a problem with doing this, but I'll show you what happens. So it's going to find the player's position and match it, which is great. The health gauge follows them. Unfortunately, the health gauge is glued to them. So we want to adjust that so the health gauge is no longer glued to the player. In order to do that, we're going to add one more option. We're going to add a vector 3 add. There it is. Vector 3 add, we're going to add that before we set the position. You don't want to do it after you set position because you need to add it before it, or else it won't update. So we're going to take the original, which is the position, and we're going to add a number to it, and we need a number to add. So I'm going to go to variables, and I'm going to make a new position. And this new position is again going to be a vector 3, and here I can type in coordinates, but I need to know what those coordinates are. And then we'll go here to this one, and we're going to add the position to the new position and do that every frame. But in order to figure out where this new position is, I need to basically take this one off. I can set it to none, or just turn that off, or just do it once. I'll probably just do it once. This way it won't do it every frame and only align it once. So when I press play, boom, the player, it matches here. But when the player moves, it no longer moves. It just clicks for that one time to match the player. So let's do this again. Alright, so now we have the health bar right here. If I take this and move this, I can take a look at these numbers now. So these numbers are the numbers I'm looking for. If I press Control Z, it's starting at 0, 1, 0, 1. So I need to take account and minus these numbers, I think. So if I move this over to here and kind of looking at where it's aligning in the scene mode, I want it to be right about there. And that's where we'll leave the health gauge, I suppose. And kind of let's round these numbers off a little. So I'll use 2.3 and let's try 2.1. Alright, so that works pretty well. It's easy to memorize numbers. So I wonder if I could do even easier. It moves it over too much. I'll put it back there. Alright, so negative 2.3 and 2.1. So we're going to take those two numbers, and once we're in play mode, we cancel this out, it'll erase these numbers. So let's memorize it first. Negative 2.3 and 2.1. So unpause that, go here, we'll set our variable. So we're going to add the new position to what it currently is. So this was negative 2.3, and this is 2.1. We might need to adjust this y value again. So if I press play, it's going to add the original position to that one. But because the position already had a 1 to begin with when I first started it, it added the 1.01 to the 2.1 that I started with. So I need to minus that from the original number. So I need to take off 1.01, or I'll just round off and say, just take 1 off. Alright, so that should be what we need. It'll calculate it based on the screen, but again, depending on your screen shape, it might cut off different rates. So you just have to figure out which screen shape you're going to use when you make your game before you adjust it. So wherever this sits isn't super important at the moment anymore because it'll update as soon as the game starts. So you might see it kind of jump a little bit. Alright, so if I press play now, Boom. So now it's sitting in the right position. It updated it, but it still doesn't move yet. And the reason is because I turned off every frame. So let's update every frame. So in a quick review, it's going to get the position of the character. It's going to add a little bit to leave it on the left so it's not sitting on him, it's moving into the corner. And then it's going to set that as the final position, all of which doing it every frame. So when I press play now, the health gauge will follow him wherever he goes. There might be an easier way of doing this using the GUI, graphical user interface, but this seems to work pretty well. When you look at the scene mode, you can see that it follows him wherever he goes, and the green seems to be a lot more easier to read than the blue one I had last time. But again, if you wanted to put a red bar behind him, you could put the red bar behind him. Also of note, see how it, the green suddenly popped in front because they're both on the same layer. So let's pause that. Let's go to the health bar. The health bar has a layer order of 0, and the health gauge has a layer order of 0, so it's kind of a random chance which one will sit in front of the other. So I'm going to put a layer order of 1, which means it's higher up, so now it'll always be in front. And when I press play, you don't have to worry about the random chance of which one's going to appear over which. So if I walk over here and collide with the slime, you can see he's dropping out 30 at a time, and boom, I restart, and it's always going to be underneath. Alright, and I guess if I wanted to demonstrate real quick, I take the health bar, I can put a new one under here. Let's say I wanted this one to be red, so he is losing life. Close that out, put this over here, and I'm going to put this as a layer order of -1, so it goes underneath of the green, and this also needs to be parented to the health gauge, and then I press play. So as the player gets hit, since there's now 2 health bars, one has code to change and the other is an original, now you can see that he has a different color, so you can see he's minusing health. So if you wanted to have a color change like there, or just empty to the background color, either option works. But we now have a fancy health gauge that loses hit points. So the last thing to do is the lives. Alright, so in order to do the lives, let's switch out. We need to add the heart to the game. So we're going to take the health gauge heart, and we're going to drop this into the scene. Actually, no, we're not going to put this in the scene. We're going to do something different. We're going to use GUI for this instead, so we're not going to have a sprite sitting on the screen. So this will look a little bit different. We're going to go to the health. Actually, we're going to make a brand new empty sprite. So create empty. And this create empty doesn't need to be parented, doesn't need to be placed anywhere, because we're automatically going to tell it where to appear with the GUI. But I'll leave it up here for now, and if I want to, I could even parent it together. I'm going to at least call it lives, so I know what this is. So this is my live section, and add component, Playmaker FSM. So now I have the FSM one here. I'm going to call this lives, so I know what this is. And edit. Actually, it's already here. Alright, so state number 1. We want to call this one, let's say, heart count. So I have a heart count, so I know how many hearts I have. And then I'm going to make a whole bunch of events. There's probably a much easier way to do this, but I'm not sure how to do it otherwise. So again, this is probably not the best way to do this, but it does work. Just if you happen to have 20 hearts like Zelda, this would be not the best way of doing this. Alright, so we'll call this 0 hearts for the first one, and then 1 heart, and then 2 hearts, and we're going to keep doing this for, I guess, the 5 hearts that we're going to use. So I might also do it now. 3 hearts, 4 hearts, and 5 hearts. So we have 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. We're going to take all these different events, add transition. So when we have 0 hearts, add transition. We have 1 heart, add transition, 2 hearts. And so we're going to determine what happens when we have all these different numbers. So again, it's probably not the best idea of doing this. It's kind of, it takes a lot, or it takes a lot of coding basically. So we're going to take all of these, and now we're going to denote what's going to happen on each of these. So the first thing I want to add, the very first thing, we want to enable GUI. If you don't enable the GUI, you won't have any hearts appearing on the screen. So that's really important. That's kind of very annoying if you try and do all the code and you're like, why isn't it appearing? You just have to enable the GUI first. Alright, so now I'm going to add an integer clamp, and I'm going to use integers instead of float. Float means decimal places, so there's no need to use decimal places if you have a set number of lives. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 doesn't need decimal places. You don't have a 1.3 lives, you have 1 or 2 lives. So I'm going to use integers. Integer clamp I'm going to put on here, and the integer variable, we don't have one yet, so I'm going to click a new variable and create one. Let's call this, alright, instead of using variable, I want to use a global variable because this will affect other things as well. So I'm going to put a global variable, and I'm going to make a new one. So instead of player health, I'm going to have player lives. And player lives, let's add that on there. And he's going to start with 5 lives. So you can start with 3 lives and add up to 5, or however you want to do that. But I'm going to say he's going to start with the maximum amount 5. This doesn't need to be the maximum amount. You can go past this. That's what the clamp's going to do. It's going to determine what the minimum and maximum is, but this is just the starting number. So let's close that out. So the player has 5 lives. It won't appear here until we've put it in the code. So we're going to grab our integer variable. Actually, it's not grabbing it. Was it not used? Let's check that again. Oh, it's a float. We can't grab the... so change that to integer. Nope, not the health, the lives. Otherwise, we'd have press yes for that. So now the player lives is an integer, meaning a non-decimal number. So now we can grab it here. Global player lives. And that's because integer clamp. If we were to do float clamp, then you'd only be able to grab a float number. So that's the difference between integer float and clamp float. Alright, so we're going to use integer float, and we're going to set the minimum, so he's allowed to have 0 lives, and he's allowed to have 5 maximum. If you didn't want a maximum number, you could have it go all the way across your screen. But I'm going to say he has a maximum of 5. And we're going to do this every frame, so it's constantly updating how many lives he has. Alright, so now we're going to start doing integer compare. Which again can be float compare, but we're not using floats, we're using integers, but you can pick and choose whichever one you want. Take the integer compare, drop it in here, and there's no events yet, so we're going to compare the global's player lives. So we've started with 5, so 5 is the default number. It's going to compare it to 0, and it's going to say if it's equal to 0 hearts, then, and again every frame, then go to the 0 hearts option. So let's make a state called 0 hearts and drag 0 hearts to here. So what happens when we're at 0 hearts? We want to have, I guess we'll get back to that. Let's jump back to here real quick. So let's go, we have compare, so 0 hearts. So now it's basically a lot of copy and paste. We're going to Control C to copy this, click underneath of it, Control V to paste, and say when the lives is equal to 1, go to 1 heart, and do this every frame. So again, probably not the most practical method of doing this, especially if you have a lot of lives, but this should work. That's 2. So 2 hearts, 2 lives. This is 3 and 3. This is 4 and 4. And this is 5 and 5. Alright, and we've already assigned the integer clamp to saying 0 to 5, so it can only be these options. It won't be any other option. So a lot of copy and paste on these things, but that should work. So now we need to do multiple states again. So for the 0 hearts, we're going to say go back to the finished state. I guess if you wanted to, let's see, in order to go back to the finished state rather than getting stuck on here, the transition finished won't go back to here by default unless you have something telling it to go back to default. So I'm going to put finished here and say wait for, let's say, 0.01. just enough time to, which is like no time at all, just go back to there. And now here's where you would also put, once your health is 0, basically go to the home menu of the game over, level, basically completely game over. Whereas the other one, the health gauge goes down, then it restarts your level. If you wanted to just restart the level, then it's kind of pointless to even have lives because you're just restarting the level every time. But you would want to go back to the home menu at this point and ask for like a major continue option or something in this 0 hearts section. So 1 hearts now. We need a new state, so add state. I'm going to call this 1 heart. And the 1 heart will go to the 1 heart state, and we need to add a finish transition here. So it goes back to here when it's done, and on the this part we're going to add a draw texture. And since we're using GUI again, graphical user interface, where we can draw textures, but if you don't have the enable GUI on here, then it's not going to draw textures. And now we're going to assign what texture we want by clicking the select button. Scroll down here and find the heart as my icon. So I'm going to draw a heart, and now here's where we got to figure out what position we want that to appear in. So if I were to press play, let's set the alright, so normalized means it's going to be 1 is 100%. So if I were to press play, it's going to draw the texture if I have 1 heart, but we start off with 5 hearts, so that's not going to work. We need to go and let's go to the global variables and set the lives to 1 just so we can start off with 1 and code some stuff. And we'll change that back to 5 later. Alright, so if I press play, because it starts off at 1 heart, it'll draw 1 heart. But going back to the 1 heart, when it draws it, this normalized option means 1 is a full percentage. So if I wanted to have a different percent, I'd be scaling it. So this is a percentage. So if you don't use normalize and you uncheck this, what you're going to get is actual pixels. So if I made this sprite at 32 by 32 pixels, now I get the full size. And so that's what the difference is between normalized is using percentage of the screen versus don't use normalized and you'll get pixel percents. I think I drew it at 32, so I'm going to use the 32 to kind of keep it in that shape. But if I didn't, I can modify this shape as well. And it doesn't appear right here, but it does appear here because it's a graphical, a GUI thing. It's not a in the scene option, only appears in the camera view when the game starts. And the location is the left and top. So I'm going to slide this over to the left and keep sliding it until I'm happy with the location. Looks like 96 should do it. And I want to put this under the health gauge, so let's slide the top one down. If I go upwards, it'll go off the screen. So I'm going to slide this down to something like, I guess that should work. Let's say 70, 74 should do it. Alright, so maybe 96 should probably go to 100. It puts it over a little more. Alright, so 174 from the top, and so that puts our first one in place. But again, we're in play mode, so as soon as we cancel out, it'll erase our numbers, so we need to memorize these numbers. So 100, 74, 32, 32. So we'll actually, let's check one more thing. Stretch to fill, we can do scale to fit, and we can do scale and crop. And you can see we get different shapes, whether it's stretching it or just scaling to fit. It looks more heart-shaped, I guess, rounded. It's cropped, so that might have been the original shape. So either way, however you want to do that. So 100, 74, 32, 32. Pause that, and let's go back to here, and the numbers got reset. So 100, 74, 32, 32, non-normalized, and scale and crop was the options I had before. Alright, so that'll be the location for all this. So if I press play now, it should automatically start right there. Perfect. Alright, now here's where it gets a little more, actually, one more thing. We're going to do integer changed. We'll switch this and drop this on the bottom. So as soon as you have 1 heart, it'll show 1 heart, and it won't go back there until we have a change in the player lives. And then we'll go to finished. So if the player's life doesn't change, it'll only do this one time. It won't keep redrawing hearts over multiple times. When it does change based on the health gauge minusing a life, it'll jump back to here, and when it goes to here, it'll ask how many hearts does it have. And so let's copy this a couple more times. Copy state, paste state, and we're going to change this one from actually this is 2, and it added a 2 on here because it was the duplicate name. So 2 hearts. Actually, let's put an S on there. Alright, so 2 hearts, and because we copied it, the only thing we need to do now is duplicate this state. We can leave the integer changed, but we need this. Copy, selected actions, and paste before this one. So now I have 2. They're going to overlap at the moment, but if I take the 100 to the left and I add 32 pixels, which is the size of it, so I have an original. So the original, if I have 2 hearts, it'll draw 1 in position 1, and the second in position 2, 32 pixels further over. So if I press play, actually we need to change his lives first. So let's go over to the global variables and say his global lives are 2 now. And then press play. So it should start with 2 lives now because the code will read 2. Actually, it's not. Let's check that again. Did the globals update? Yep, the global's updated. We don't have the connection between the two. 2 goes to 2. Alright, now let's try that again. And finished goes back to there. So now it should update with the 2 hearts. So we have 2 hearts on here. They should move with the character because it's graphically on the screen by a percentage, whereas this one's following the character, but these are graphically being placed in here. And he has 2 lives. So if he were to lose a life now, it would jump down to the other one. So he's going to lose health, but we haven't told anything once the health is gone to restart a life. So let's finish up this code real quick. We're going to copy and paste again. Copy state, paste state. This one's going to be 3 hearts. And we're going to add a new one. So I've got the first one, let's minus that, minus the second one. Copy selected actions, paste before or after. I guess it doesn't matter. This one we're going to add 32 more, so it's going to be 64 difference. And close that up again. We're going to copy this one, paste it again. We're going to call this one four hearts. And then paste another one. Oops, I don't want to paste all of them. Copy action, paste action before, and again add 32 more. So we'll have 96. Alright, and then one last time. Copy state, paste state, rename it to 5 hearts. Let's close that. Copy action, paste selected actions before, and call this one 32 plus 96 is going to be 128, I think. Oops, 228 because we already had it one. So 228 should be the final result. And now we connect our lines. 3 hearts goes there, 4 hearts goes there, 5 hearts goes there, finished goes back up to there, finished up to there, and finished up to there. So it gets kind of redundant, or not redundant, but a lot of extra lines. There's probably a much easier way to do this, but I'm not really sure what that easier way would be. So this seems to work. Alright, so everything should be set now. Until we have a way to change his lives, it's not going to, can't like, if we made one of those inspector variables, we could slide the lives up and down to see how that works, but I need a variable that will do that. And as long as I'm using the global variable, I can't adjust his lives, unless I were to make a variable that overwrites the original, which I could do real quick. The important thing is to change the health gauge to modify it. So we're going to go to the health gauge and the health bar code. Alright, so we're going to check for hit, and if the player loses a life over here, it's not just going to set his health to 100 and restart the level. We need to add one more thing. So we're going to set, I guess, what was this again? Integer add or integer subtract. There is no integer subtract. If I go to math, yep, there's only integer add, so you don't have the option to subtract an integer. You only have the option for add. So I'm going to take integer add, drop this in here, and change the integer from globals, lives. I'm going to add a -1. And I don't need to do every frame. So when the character loses his life, he's going to restart. It's going to minus a life from his allotment of lives. It's going to reset his health back to 100, and it's going to restart the level. And that's all when he loses his life. So when we start this, he should start off with 2 lives because that's where he last left our global variable at. He walks over to the slime. The slime's going to hit him. He's going to lose his life, and eventually it'll minus a heart. So we walk over here again, and the slime will hit him again, and he'll lose his life, and it restarts back to 0. And since we haven't coded anything for 0, when he loses his life again, it'll just restart. But at the 0 point, over back on the live section, this is where you would have go back to game menu if he has 0 hearts at any point. So that's how that would work. And let's put this health gauge, the lives inside health gauge. You don't need to parent this because it's automatically going to follow the screen. This keeps it a little organized, and I can minus that and call this the whole health gauge section. So, in a quick review, we have the health bar following the player. He starts off with 2 hearts. If I wanted to change that to be a much higher number, I go back to the variables, global variables. He'll start off with the player lives being 5, and then close that. So he has the full amount, 5 lives, and the code is asking, that's going to clamp it between 0 and 5. It's going to check this every frame, and whenever he walks around, it's going to start minusing his health away and minusing a life every time. And the enemies, when they collide with me, take off 10 hit points. You could do when collide with player, cause the player to have some kind of reaction where he bumps or he gets hit or something. You could add that to the animator section and put a variable for that. But this works pretty much to show you how to do the life icon and the health bar minusing. One last thing, if you want to get rid of all these symbols that appear, the reason they're appearing is because we have as long as you have enabled GUI on here, it's going to show those icons. If you want to get rid of that, you can check the preferences setting inside of Playmaker, and you have somewhere in here, enable select. Show edit line. I'm not sure where it is. I guess they might have changed it in Unity 5. Unless it's one of these. But either way, in order to get rid of that, this show state labels, there it is, show state labels in game view. It already is unchecked, but it's still showing it anyway. That's because the scripts themselves are overwriting the preferences for some reason. So if I check show state label, I'd have to do it for everything that has Playmaker code. So click on health bar. This is Playmaker code, show state label. Health gauge has that, so show state label. Bat flying has 1, 2, 3 different Playmaker codes on him. This bat flying will take off that state label, that state label, that state label, and that one. And then the slime's going to have a couple. And by doing this, it's kind kind of annoying that it shows up there, but we're using GUI, so it's going to update like that. We'll take the player and remove the last of them, show the state labels. Alright, so now we're good. So now we press play, we're not going to have all the state labels floating around the screen. So now it's back to game view. So we're fine. And that pretty much covers how all this works. Again, if we get hit by an enemy, it's going to minus our life away and restart the level.